What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and in this video I'm bringing you the strongest non-consecration Titan build in the entire game. Now, full disclosure right off the bat, I'm in Mexico for a friend's wedding when this build is releasing, but I wanted to get the build in your hands before I took off. As a result, I do not know the artifact mods that are coming, therefore no artifact mods will be included. But I like to think I've taught my audience well enough over the years that they know how to build craft for themselves. So if there's an artifact mod that enhances this build, just put it on. But here's the good news, this build does not need artifact mods to absolutely destroy content. It can deal with 2 of the 3 champion types intrinsically, and on top of this, it works in literally all content. I'm not exaggerating. I've wanted to make this build video for years now, basically since the introduction of Strand, but I've always struggled with how to set it up. There's a lot of detailed math going on under the hood, and while it would be fun to deep dive into all the damage stacking and stuff that's going on, I'm going to refrain. Reason being is it will just convolute the information that matters, and what matters is the fact that this build just flat out wrecks everything. And it's very simple to play and do well with, you just have to play aggressively. I've talked a lot recently about the best builds granting a huge payoff for very little investment, and this build is basically the king of that philosophy. Basically, it is just get glaive kills and profit. So let's break it down. It centers around 2 exotic Titan arms. You of course have the all everything exotic in the Syntheseps, which buffs your melee damage and your super damage. Again, I could go into huge detail here with comparing damage numbers, but I'm not going to do that. Rather, I will just show you as I go. So you deal 50% increased super damage, making your Blade Fury super an absolute force in endgame content. And then it buffs your melee damage by 165%, and on top of this, it buffs Glaive's damage by 100%. And you get plus 35 to handling and reload speed, all just for being surrounded by enemies, which you constantly are with this build. The other arms you can pair it with is Wormgod's Caress. Defeating a target with melee or a finisher grants escalating melee damage which decays over time. Higher levels of Burning Fist grants increased weapon damage. On screen now is all the stacking damage numbers. Again, I was going to go deep into it, but that's not really necessary. What you have to know is that these exotics work with your glaive melee, and therefore your glaive melee attacks hit like a truck. At the end of the day, that is what matters with this build. Just steamrolling through enemies with your glaives. So onto the build, we of course are on Strand thanks to the Banner of War aspect. You could also run this on Prismatic if you wanted, but I will focus on my Strand setup. As of the making of this video, Knockout does not proc health regeneration when you have a glaive, and that is why we opt for Strand, because the health regeneration from Banner of War is excellent for keeping you alive. So how do we kit out our build? Well, as I said, Banner of War is a must and it's absolutely perfect. Basically, when we get a melee kill, finisher, or sword kill, we get Banner of War that pulses and periodically heals us, and it increases melee and sword damage. This works with glaive melee kills as well. And since we get so many with this build, we pretty much always have Banner of War. Again, I could go into all the ins and outs and damage stacking, but I'm not going to. The buffs that this aspect grants are reduced when you're running Wormgods or Synthos, but trust me, these nerfs are not a big deal. It's still incredibly strong to pair with this build, and like I said, the healing pulses really help keep you alive. So next we have Into the Fray. This grants you Woven Mail when you destroy a Tangle, which is great for survivability, and it also gives increased melee regen. The melee regen is actually really nice because this build hits like a truck with your charge melees as well. Yes, you do the bulk of your damage with glaives, but you can also use a 1-2 punch shotgun with this build and deal a shit ton of damage with your melees. And you can also run a grapple grenade for even more damage. Or you can run a shackle grenade for more utility, like suspending unstoppables to stun them. This build gives you a ton of flexibility and freedom, but running these aspects is a must. Onto the fragments, here's what I like to run. Thread of Fury for even more melee energy when we destroy a Tangle. This helps ensure that we always have a melee ability ready. Thread of Warding, picking up an Orb of Power grants Woven Mail. Because this is such an aggro build, the damage resistance is really nice for being able to tank damage in even the hardest of content. Next is Thread of Generation, where dealing damage grants grenade energy. This just gives us more shackle or grapple grenades, and the shackle grenades can be really handy for getting the loop going. Say you are in a transition area of a strike, so now all your stacks are gone and you have no Banner of War. Well, now when you get to the action, you can suspend enemies to make them not a threat. Then just take them out with your glaive quickly, and now you have Banner of War going and maybe some stacks of Burning Fists. Now you have the engine roaring and you can just keep slaying out. So being able to have a grenade more often is very helpful. And finally, we have Thread of Transmutation. This one isn't really needed, but it's nice to have. While you have Woven Mail, Weapon Final Blows create a Tangle. So we want to make lots of tangles as they give us woven mail from Into the Fray. And then when we get a final blow, we will get another tangle and we just keep the loop going. This doesn't work perfectly as the tangle cooldown is longer than the duration of woven mail, but it works very often. But this fragment is optional if you want to run something else. Thread of Binding is really nice for the super and would be great. And speaking of suspending enemies in your super, which this does, did you know that your super does more damage to suspended targets? Yep, 25% more. And your heavy attack in your super can suspend enemies, so to deal max damage, the best thing you can do is a heavy attack, followed by light attacks until they fall, and then just rinse and repeat. So this next part is very interesting. Biotic Enhancements just gives a flat 50% more damage in your super, but Worm God Stacks gives you more super damage for your light attack alone, but the damage is only 40%, not 50%. And it does not apply to the heavy swing, only the light attack because it acts like a punch. There are other damage multipliers and nerfs going on with Banner of War, but again, I don't want to dive into the fine details of all the different numbers as this video would be a half hour long, and the fine folks at the Destiny Data Compendium have done most of the work for us anyways. So instead, I will just show different damage numbers for the super depending on what we're running. The point of all this is to say that both of these exotic arm pieces can buff our super in some way. But for the best super damage, use Syntheseps, and for general play, Synthos are just flat out better. They don't take any time to ramp up like Worm Gods do. So while you can deal more damage with Worm Gods fully spun up, Synthos deals bigger damage more immediately, and you get the benefit of the stronger super. But as is always the case, it really just comes down to the content that you're running. I ran the same Lost Sector with both setups and both worked great. I will play them in the background of the video, and you can see the strengths and weaknesses of each. If no enemies are around, well, Worm God can deal high damage for longer thanks to how it decays, but Synthos can slay out right away, which is very helpful in most situations. I just wanted to highlight both because they both wreck with this setup, and it's kind of a to each their own sort of situation. And how about another goofy Bungie spaghetti code scenario? So if you didn't know, frozen enemies take 120% more melee damage from a base melee attack. And as of the making of this video, Glaive melees are base melee attacks. However, thanks to a nerf that happened years ago, Worm Gods does not get this benefit. A fully revved up Worm God melee on a frozen Carl hits for 66,960 damage, when it should be more than double that. You can see a base Winterbite melee hits for 46,813 damage on Carl when he's frozen. So Worm Gods is only hitting for 43% more damage. Now if we use Synthos, we hit for 93,625 damage. But here's where things get really crazy. In the recent tweet regarding sandbox changes, Bungie is buffing the third hit of a Glaive melee combo to deal double damage. See, in the past, and in a lot of gameplay that you've been seeing, I hold block to get more DPS with my Glaive melees. I do a 1-2-1-2 combo rather than the 1-2-3 that many people use, and is probably what Bungie intended for people to do. So now, that third hit will deal double damage, and Winterbite stacks 40 stacks of slow on an enemy with every hit. So you can now deal double damage with the last hit, and that should apply a freeze, and then your next hit is also going to deal a ton of damage. So basically you're just dealing even more damage. And speaking of Winterbite, that is my go-to with this build. Its Glaive melees hit for more damage than any other Glaive, so it's a logical best choice. It can also freeze enemies with its projectile, again making it really easy to close the gap to get the loop going. On top of this, the slow can stun overloads, and obviously it can freeze in the projectile or melee form so it can deal with unstops. So yeah, it's just a no-brainer pick. But if defense is what you're going for, then you could use Vexcalibur. It's getting a buff which will make it even better than it already is, and it provides you with a Void Overshield. So now you can have a Void Overshield as well as Woven Mail, plus health regen from Banner, so you're effectively unkillable. You could also go with a Glaive with close to melee if you want something else for your heavy or exotic slot, and I also like to run a 1-2 punch shotgun with this build so that I can just delete enemies quickly with a 1-2 punch melee. This build has so much firepower and literally infinite total damage thanks to Glaive melees requiring no ammo to use. You can see in the background gameplay that this build absolutely wrecks. And there are nerfs coming to Consecration, though I do think that build will still be very strong, but this legitimately could be the best Titan build in the game now. It's one of my all-time favorites, and I'm happy to finally showcase it to you in its final form. Anyways, that's it for the video. I hope it was helpful, and if it was, a like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. Thanks for watching if you're still here, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care. Hey, if you're still here, then thanks so much for watching to the end. If you like what I do and you want to support me further, then consider becoming a channel member. You'll get your name featured on the end screen, custom badges, and other cool rewards. You can also join my community Discord if that interests you, and if you want to see me stream, be sure to follow me on Twitch at itstizzle7 where I stream semi-regularly. Those are linked in the description. Anyways, that's enough self-promotion. Thanks for watching. Take care.